So I'm Richard Falk, 69 years young, and I like things just so, always have. It's not about being fussy, mind you. It's about order, precision. A place for everything and everything in its place, as they say. 30 years at Mercedes-Benz will do that to a man. Precision engineering, attention to detail. Those gleaming lines, the perfectly calibrated engines, the smell of new leather, it gets into your blood. That was my life, my passion. And now, retired, I still like things a certain way. It's a comfort, a familiar rhythm in a world that's constantly changing. I settled into my seat, 27B aisle seat, just the way I like it. Little more legroom. Easier to get up. I'm not as nimble as I used to be, the knees aren't what they were. I remember once in Stuttgart, chasing after a prototype down the test track, felt like a spring chicken then. Now it's a slow, deliberate lowering into the seat, a little sigh of contentment as the cushions yield. I wiggled around a bit, getting comfortable, adjusting the small of my back against the surprisingly supportive headrest. Pulled the seatbelt across. Click, that little click, always liked that sound, solid, secure, like everything was in its right place. A reassuring affirmation in a world full of uncertainties, and for me everything usually is. Or at least I try my best to make it so. The plane was filling up, people bustling about, a cacophony of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps, overhead compartments banging shut with varying degrees of force. Babies crying, a high-pitched wail cutting through the general murmur. The usual airport noise didn't bother me much. I was used to it. Traveled a fair bit from Mercedes back in the day, all over the world. Tokyo, the neon lights reflecting off the polished chrome of our latest models. Stuttgart, the birthplace of the brand, steeped in history and tradition. Detroit, the heart of American automotive might, a fascinating clash of cultures. You name it, I'd been there, seen it, negotiated the deals, celebrated the successes. This flight to Malaga, a simple holiday, felt like a stroll in the park compared to those high-pressure trips. I took my copy of The Economist out of my bag, a worn, familiar weight in my hand. Worn a bit at the edges, testament to the countless hours I'd spent absorbed in its pages. Read it cover to cover every week. Keeps me sharp. Keeps me informed. Like to know what's going on in the world, even in retirement. The world keeps spinning even if I've stepped off the corporate carousel. Opened it up to the first page. Nice crisp feel of the paper. The faint scent of ink. Always preferred paper to those electronic readers. Something about the tactile experience, the turning of the pages that felt more real, more substantial. Took a deep breath, letting the familiar rustle of the paper fill the brief silence. Closed my eyes for a second, just enjoying the quiet before the flight, the anticipation of a new adventure. Everything felt right, calm, ordered, just the way I liked it. Retirement suited me. No more deadlines, no more board meetings, no more endless conference calls, just peace and quiet, time to myself, time to read, to reflect, to travel at my own pace. And The Economist, of course, my window to the world. I adjusted my glasses, the familiar weight settling on the bridge of my nose. Started reading an article about the European Central Bank. Interesting stuff. Always liked keeping up with the financial news. A habit from my working days, a way to keep my finger on the pulse of the global economy. Sip some water from the little bottle they give you. Cool, refreshing. Then back to the article, absorbing the details, analyzing the implications. Everything was peaceful. Everything was in its place. The gentle hum of the plane's air conditioning, the quiet chatter of the other passengers, the rustle of my magazine. It was all a soothing symphony of normalcy. Little did I know, well, that's a story for another cup of coffee, and perhaps a bit of something stronger. They announced the Meet the Pilot thing. Not something I usually bothered with, but this time something niggled at me. I'd glanced at the altimeter reading when I boarded. Something seemed off, just a hair off, barely noticeable. But after 30 years dealing with precision instruments, you develop an eye for these things. It's like a sixth sense. A tiny flicker in the back of your mind that says, something's not quite right. So I folded my Economist, placed it carefully on the seat next to me, and made my way to the front of the plane. Slow and steady, minding my knees. The cockpit door was open. A young pilot stood there shaking hands, introducing himself. Jenkins, his name was, clean-cut, confident, maybe a little too confident. I waited my turn, hands clasped behind my back, observing. He had that look. The look of someone who thinks they know everything. A look I'd seen 1,000 times before, on young engineers fresh out of university, brimming with theoretical knowledge but lacking the practical experience that comes from years of working with real machines, real problems. When it was my turn, I extended my hand. "Richard Falk," I said. "Pleasure to meet you, Captain." "Likewise, sir," he replied, his grip firm, his smile a bit too practiced. "Anything I can do for you?" "Just a quick question, Captain," I said, pointing towards the altimeter. I noticed a slight discrepancy in the reading when I boarded. Barely perceptible, I know, but... He cut me off with a chuckle. A condescending little chuckle that grated on my nerves. "Relax, Grandpa," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Leave the flying to the pros." The other crew members, a young co-pilot and a flight attendant, joined in the laughter. Their amusement echoed through the small cockpit, bouncing off the instrument panels and settling like a cold weight in my stomach. I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. "Just an observation, Captain," I said, my voice calm, controlled. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught me the art of maintaining composure, even under pressure, even when faced with blatant disrespect. A lifetime of working with precision instruments tends to make one observant. Jenkins waved his hand dismissively. "Don't you worry about it, sir," he said. "These birds practically fly themselves these days, all computerized. State of the art." He winked at the flight attendant, another ripple of laughter. I nodded, a tight little nod. "Of course, Captain," I said. "State of the art." I turned and walked back to my seat, the laughter following me like a swarm of stinging insects. I walked slowly back to my seat, each step deliberate, measured. My face, I knew, was a mask of calm. Years of dealing with difficult personalities, demanding executives, and cutthroat competitors had taught me the value of a poker face. But inside, a storm was brewing. The laughter, that casual, dismissive laughter, echoed in my ears, each chuckle a tiny barb digging deeper into my pride. It wasn't just the words, the grandpa comment, though that stung. It was the attitude, the casual disregard for experience, the arrogant assumption that youth and technology somehow trumped decades of hard-earned knowledge. I felt a tightness in my chest, a constriction that made it hard to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of anger. I sat down heavily, the familiar comfort of the seat now offering little solace. My hands, usually so steady, so precise, hands that had assembled intricate engine components, hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, hands that had held my wife's hand as we walked along the beach at sunset, those hands now trembled slightly. I clasped them together, trying to still the tremors, trying to regain control. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep, slow breath. In, hold, out. The simple act, a familiar anchor in moments of stress, helped to quell the rising panic. I opened my eyes, focusing on the small details around me. The texture of the seat fabric, the pattern on the carpet, the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Small, concrete things, grounding me in the present, pulling me back from the swirling vortex of anger and humiliation. The knot in my throat remained, a constant reminder of the insult, but the trembling subsided. The mask of composure was back in place, firmly affixed. No one would see the turmoil within. No one needed to. I reached for my Economist, the familiar weight a small comfort in my hand. I tried to focus on the words, on the intricate dance of global finance, but the letters blurred. The sentences swam before my eyes. Jenkins's condescending chuckle kept intruding, a persistent echo in the quiet recesses of my mind. I took another deep breath, forcing myself to concentrate, to push the anger down, to bury it beneath layers of professional detachment. I wouldn't let him see how much his words had affected me. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But the knot remained, a hard lump of resentment lodged firmly in my throat. And in that moment I knew with a chilling certainty that I wouldn't let this go. Not this time. The young pilot's laughter, that casual, dismissive sound, triggered something deep inside me. It wasn't just about the altimeter. It was about something bigger. It was about respect, about the value of experience, about a lifetime dedicated to precision, to excellence, being brushed aside with a chuckle and a wink. I stared out the window, the airport lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color, but I wasn't really seeing them. I was seeing the Mercedes-Benz engineering labs in Stuttgart. I could almost smell the oil, the metal, the faint scent of ozone from the welding torches. I remembered the long hours, the late nights, the endless calculations, the meticulous design work, the constant pressure to innovate, to improve, to push the boundaries of automotive engineering. I remembered the weight of responsibility I carried on my shoulders, not just for the performance of the cars, but for the safety of the people who would drive them. Every bolt, every weld, every line of code had to be perfect. There was no room for error, not when lives were at stake. I spent countless hours poring over blueprints, testing prototypes, analyzing data, refining designs. It was a demanding job, but it was also a privilege. A privilege to be part of something bigger than myself, something that contributed to the world, something that made a difference. And now, here I was, being dismissed by a young pilot who probably hadn't even been born when I was designing the anti-lock braking systems that saved countless lives. The contrast was stark, painful. It felt like a betrayal, not just of myself, but of all the engineers, the designers, the technicians, who had dedicated their lives to creating machines that were not only beautiful but also safe and reliable. I thought about the early days of my career, the excitement of working on cutting-edge technology, the thrill of seeing a design come to life, the satisfaction of knowing that my work was making a difference. I thought about the challenges, the setbacks, the long hours, the sacrifices. But through it all, there was always the respect of my colleagues, the recognition of my expertise, the knowledge that my contributions were valued. And now this casual dismissal, this arrogant assumption that experience was somehow irrelevant, that technology had rendered human expertise obsolete. The thought burned in my chest, a slow, simmering anger that threatened to boil over. I clenched my jaw, trying to control the rising tide of resentment. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that anger wouldn't solve anything. But the knot in my throat remained, a hard, bitter reminder of the humiliation I had just endured. The more I thought about it, the more the injustice of it all gnawed at me. This wasn't just about me. It was about a generation of engineers, of builders, of creators, whose contributions were being forgotten, dismissed, erased by the relentless march of technology. And I knew with a growing certainty that I couldn't let it stand. I wouldn't let it stand. The anger, hot and sharp at first, began to cool. It didn't disappear, not completely. It settled deeper, hardening into something cold, something hard, a quiet resolve. I looked out the window, the airport lights a meaningless blur. I wasn't seeing them. I was seeing blueprints, calculations, test results. A lifetime of work, a lifetime of dedication to precision and excellence flashing before my eyes. I thought about the young pilot Jenkins, his confident smile, his dismissive chuckle, the easy arrogance of youth. He thought he knew everything. He thought technology had all the answers. He thought experience was obsolete, a relic of the past, a quaint anecdote to be shared with a condescending pat on the head. He was wrong, dead wrong. Technology was a tool, a powerful tool, yes. But it was just that, a tool. It needed a guiding hand, a skilled operator, someone who understood not just the how but the why, someone who had seen the limitations of technology, the unexpected failures, the unforeseen consequences. Someone who knew that real-world experience wasn't something you could download from a computer. I took a slow, deep breath. The knot in my throat loosened a bit. The anger was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't just about the insult, the disrespect. It was about something more. It was about responsibility, about duty, about the safety of everyone on that plane. Jenkins, in his youthful arrogance, had dismissed my concern about the altimeter. He'd laughed it off. He'd called me Grandpa. He thought he knew better, but he didn't. He didn't have the experience. He didn't have the deep, intuitive understanding of machines that came from decades of working with them, of pushing them to their limits, of seeing them fail and learning from those failures. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that something wasn't right with that altimeter. I'd seen similar issues before, years ago, in the early days of my career at Mercedes. Subtle discrepancies, easily overlooked but potentially catastrophic. I'd spent months, years even, working on solutions, developing new calibration methods, refining designs, ensuring the safety and reliability of the systems. I closed my eyes, the memory of those long hours, those intense debates, those painstaking calculations, flooding back. I could almost feel the weight of the engineering manuals in my hands, the smooth, cool surface of the drafting table beneath my fingertips, the faint scent of machine oil in the air. I remembered the satisfaction of finding a solution, the quiet pride of knowing that my work had made a difference. I opened my eyes. The airport lights were still a blur, but my vision was clear. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit there and let this arrogant young pilot dismiss my concerns, dismiss my experience. It wasn't just about me. It was about the safety of everyone on that plane. I had something valuable to offer, something Jenkins desperately needed, and whether he liked it or not, I was going to give it to him. I had a responsibility, a duty, and I wouldn't shirk it. Not this time. Not ever. I sat there staring out the window but not really seeing anything. My mind was a whirlwind. Should I say something? Should I just keep quiet? It would be easier, certainly, to just let it go, enjoy my holiday. Forget about the arrogant young pilot and his condescending chuckle. Retirement was supposed to be about peace and quiet. No more stress. No more deadlines. No more difficult personalities. Just relaxation, travel, time with my wife. Time to read my Economist in peace. Time to potter around in the garden. This whole situation, this confrontation, was disrupting the carefully constructed tranquility of my retired life. It was like a pebble thrown into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward, disturbing the calm surface. But then, another thought intruded. What if I was right? What if there really was something wrong with the altimeter? What if Jenkins's arrogance, his blind faith in technology, led to something bad? I shuddered. I didn't even want to think about it. But the thought persisted, a nagging worry that wouldn't go away. I thought about my years at Mercedes. The countless hours spent ensuring the safety and reliability of our cars, the meticulous testing, the rigorous quality control, the constant awareness that lives depended on our work. We took that responsibility seriously, very seriously. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. And now here I was faced with a similar situation, albeit in a different context. Could I just sit here, do nothing, and risk the safety of everyone on board? The thought was unbearable. I felt a growing sense of unease, a tightening in my chest. It wasn't just about my pride anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about duty, about responsibility. I considered the risks. If I spoke up, Jenkins might just dismiss me again. He might even ridicule me in front of the whole crew. The thought stung. I didn't want to be the crazy old man, the meddling retiree who thought he knew better than the pros. I'd spent my whole career building a reputation for competence, for professionalism. I didn't want to jeopardize that now in my retirement. But then another thought, a stronger thought, pushed its way to the surface. What did my reputation matter compared to the safety of those people? What did a little embarrassment, a little ridicule, matter in the grand scheme of things. I'd faced tougher challenges in my life. I'd dealt with more difficult personalities. I could handle a little bit of mockery from a young, overconfident pilot. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs, pushing out the last vestiges of doubt. The decision was made. I would act. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, not to satisfy my wounded pride, but for the safety of everyone on board. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, and that in the end was all that mattered. I closed my eyes for a moment, the decision solidifying within me, a quiet, unwavering resolve. The ripples in the pond of my peaceful retirement might be disturbed, but the waters of my conscience would be clear. I would do what I had to do, come what may. I closed my eyes, just for a moment. The faint scent of leather and stale coffee filled the air, a familiar aroma of countless late nights spent in this very cabin. Just for a moment I allowed myself the indulgence of weakness, the briefest flicker of doubt. Was I truly ready for this? Took a deep breath. The air hitched in my throat, a momentary spasm of anxiety. Let it out slowly, forcing the tension to drain away with each exhaled molecule. The decision was made. There was no going back. This wasn't a boardroom where bluffs and calculated risks were the currency of power. This was real. I would act. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about the snickers, the whispers, the condescending pats on the back that implied I was too old, too out of touch. It wasn't about the laughter that echoed in my memory, the stinging barbs disguised as jokes. It was about responsibility, about doing what was right, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. My face, I knew, betrayed nothing. It was a blank canvas, a carefully cultivated mask of neutrality honed over decades of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations. I remembered the early days, the flustered heat rising in my cheeks at every perceived slight. Years of practice, of forcing myself to remain impassive even when every instinct screamed for a reaction, had sculpted this impenetrable facade. No flicker of emotion, no hint of the turmoil churning within. My jaw, however, was clenched tight, a subtle betrayal of the iron will I was exerting to maintain control. Just, calm, stillness. Like the surface of a deep lake in the Black Forest, a place I used to visit as a child, concealing the currents swirling beneath. The memory of the cool, dark water, the stillness broken only by the occasional ripple, offered a strange sense of peace amidst the storm raging within. Inside, though, something shifted. The anger, the resentment, the hurt, they were still there, a dull ache in my chest, a constant reminder of the betrayal, the casual disregard for everything I'd built. But they were no longer the driving force. They were fuel, a slow-burning ember providing the heat for a different kind of fire. Something else had taken hold, a quiet determination, a steely resolve, a sense of purpose. I felt a strange calmness descend, a clarity of thought that cut through the fog of emotion. I knew what I had to do, and I would do it, calmly, methodically, precisely, just like I'd always done, just like I'd learned to do in 30 years at Mercedes-Benz, where precision wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. The click of a perfectly engineered door, the smooth purr of a finely tuned engine, these were the sounds of my life, the symphony of order and control. And in this case, that precision, that meticulous attention to detail might just save a few lives. I opened my eyes. The cabin lights seemed brighter now, sharper, reflecting off the polished mahogany dashboard. The hum of the engines, a steady, reassuring drone, vibrated through the floor, a comforting reminder of power and control. Everything felt clearer. The haze of indecision had evaporated, replaced by a laser focus on the task at hand. I adjusted my grip on the controls, the cool metal a grounding sensation against my palm. I knew what I had to do, and I knew, with absolute certainty, how to do it. The faintest hint of a smile, almost imperceptible, touched the corners of my lips. Let the games begin. I settled back into my seat, the economist still folded on. The tray table. I wasn't reading it, though. My mind was elsewhere. I was watching, observing, like a hawk circling its prey. Not that I thought of Jenkins as prey exactly, more like a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. And like any good engineer, the first step in solving a problem is understanding it, analyzing it, breaking it down into its component parts. I watched Jenkins as he chatted with the co-pilot. Young fellow, the co-pilot, seemed nervous, kept glancing at Jenkins, seeking approval. Jenkins, on the other hand, exuded confidence. Too much confidence, if you asked me. He leaned back in his seat, a casual smirk on his face, gesturing with his hands as he talked. His movements were quick, almost jerky, impatient, like he couldn't wait to get this show on the road. I noticed the way he interacted with the flight attendants. Charming, yes, but also a bit dismissive. A quick smile, a pat on the arm, then back to his conversation with the co-pilot. Like they were an afterthought, a necessary nuisance, not part of the team. That bothered me. At Mercedes, we always emphasized teamwork. Everyone from the CEO to the janitor played a vital role. Respect for everyone, that was our motto. Clearly, Jenkins hadn't learned that lesson. The pre-flight checks were starting. I listened carefully, watching Jenkins's reactions. He seemed bored, going through the motions, relying heavily on the automated systems, just glancing at the readings, not really studying them. He trusted the machines, implicitly. That was a mistake, a big mistake. Machines were tools, yes, powerful tools, but they weren't infallible. They could fail. They did fail. And when they did, it was the human element, the experience, the intuition that saved the day. I remembered a time, years ago, when a prototype's braking system malfunctioned during a high-speed test. The automated systems shut down. It was my quick thinking, my deep understanding of the mechanics, that allowed me to override the system and bring the car to a safe stop. The test driver, a young hotshot, was white as a sheet when he climbed out of the car. He'd put his faith in the technology. I'd put my faith in my experience. That day, experience won. Jenkins, I suspected, hadn't had that kind of experience. He'd grown up in a world of automation, of instant feedback, of computer-generated solutions. He hadn't learned the hard lessons that came from working with real machines, with real problems, with the ever-present possibility of failure. He hadn't learned the value of caution, of meticulous attention to detail, of respecting the limitations of technology. I watched him as he flipped through the pre-flight checklist, his fingers tapping impatiently on the controls. He was relying on the machines, blindly. He hadn't even glanced at the altimeter since I'd pointed out the discrepancy. He dismissed my concern with a chuckle, a condescending chuckle. He thought he knew everything. He didn't. And that, I realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. His overconfidence, his arrogance, was a blind spot, a vulnerability, and I knew with a growing certainty that I would have to exploit that vulnerability, not for revenge, but for the safety of everyone on board. I reached up and opened the overhead compartment, slow and deliberate, like everything I did these days. The knees weren't what they used to be. I fumbled around in my bag, feeling for the familiar shape. There it was, my old engineering notebook, leather-bound, worn smooth with age. I pulled it out, the weight of it surprisingly comforting in my hand. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a companion, a repository of knowledge, a testament to a lifetime dedicated to precision and logic. I placed it carefully on the tray table, the worn leather cool against my fingertips. I unbuckled the strap, the small click of familiar sound, an echo of countless meetings, countless design sessions, countless late nights spent poring over calculations and diagrams. I opened the notebook, the pages falling open to a random entry. A complex equation, scribbled in my own hand, filled the page. I traced the lines with my finger, the familiar symbols triggering a cascade of memories. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with notes, sketches, calculations. Designs for engine components, diagrams of braking systems, complex algorithms for fuel efficiency. the language of engineering, a language I hadn't spoken in years, but one that was still as familiar to me as my own name. It was a language of precision, of logic, of order. A language that left no room for ambiguity, for guesswork, for arrogance. I paused at a page filled with diagrams of an early prototype altimeter, a similar model to the one on this plane, I suspected. I ran my finger over the intricate lines, the carefully labeled components, the precise measurements. I remembered the challenges we'd faced in designing that altimeter, the endless testing, the painstaking calibration, the constant striving for accuracy. We had to account for every variable, every potential source of error. Temperature, pressure, altitude, even the slightest vibration could affect the readings. I flipped to another page, this one filled with calculations. Complex equations, scribbled in the margins, testified to the hours I'd spent wrestling with the problem of ensuring the altimeter's reliability. I remembered the late nights, the endless cups of coffee, the frustration of hitting dead ends, the exhilaration of finally finding a solution. It was a demanding job, but it was also rewarding. Knowing that my work, my meticulous attention to detail, contributed to the safety and performance of those machines, that was the ultimate satisfaction. As I flipped through the pages of my notebook, I felt a reconnection to that part of myself, the engineer, the problem solver, the man who thrived on precision and logic. The knot in my throat, the lingering resentment from Jenkins's dismissive laughter began to loosen. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the challenge, the problem, the solution. It was about applying my knowledge, my experience to a real-world situation. And in that moment, as I flipped through the pages of my old engineering notebook, I felt a surge of excitement. A familiar thrill, the thrill of the hunt, the thrill of the chase, the thrill of finding the solution to a complex problem. The tools were dusted off. The game was on. I closed the notebook, the worn leather a comforting weight in my hand. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes, trying to visualize the instrument panel in the cockpit. The altimeter, of course, was the key, but I needed to consider the other instruments as well. The airspeed indicator, the vertical speed indicator, the attitude indicator. They all worked together, a complex interplay of data providing a complete picture of the aircraft's position and performance. A single faulty reading could throw everything off. Like a tiny crack in a dam, it could lead to a catastrophic failure. I thought back to my days at Mercedes. We faced similar challenges in designing the instrumentation for our cars. Ensuring the accuracy and reliability of the sensors, the gauges, the displays, was paramount. A driver's life could depend on it. I remembered one particular incident years ago when we were developing a new type of altimeter for our prototype off-road vehicles. We were testing it in the Alps, pushing the vehicles to their limits in extreme conditions. High altitudes, low temperatures, rough terrain. It was a brutal test, designed to expose any weaknesses in the system, and we found one. A subtle flaw in the altimeter's calibration software. It was barely noticeable at lower altitudes, but as we climbed higher, the discrepancy grew. It was a small error, a fraction of a percentage point, but at those altitudes, even a small error could have serious consequences. We could have ended up driving off a cliff. Literally. I remembered the long hours I'd spent working on a solution, poring over data logs, analyzing code, running simulations. It was a frustrating process, filled with dead ends and setbacks. But finally, after weeks of relentless effort, I'd found it. A manual recalibration method. A way to bypass the faulty software and adjust the altimeter's readings directly. It was an elegant solution, simple yet effective. And it had worked, flawlessly. I opened my eyes, a slow smile spreading across my face. The same solution, the same manual recalibration method I developed all those years ago for the Mercedes prototypes, would work here. It was perfectly suited to the situation. It was elegant, efficient, and most importantly, it didn't rely on the aircraft's automated systems. It was a purely manual procedure, relying on basic PR. Incipals of physics and engineering. Something Jenkins, with all his faith in technology, probably wouldn't even know existed. I could picture it clearly in my mind. The sequence of steps, the precise adjustments, the careful manipulation of the controls. It was like aid dance, a delicate ballet of precision and timing. And I, the old engineer, the retired grandpa, would lead the dance. I felt a surge of confidence, a familiar thrill coursing through my veins. The thrill of the challenge, the thrill of the solution, the thrill of knowing that my experience, my knowledge might just save the day. The plan was clear. Now all I had to do was wait for the right moment, the moment to execute. I waited. Patience was a virtue, my mother always said, and in my line of work it had been a necessity. At Merced's, some projects took years to develop, years of painstaking research, design, and testing. You couldn't rush those things. You had to wait for the right moment. The moment when all the pieces were in place. The moment when everything aligned. I watched Jenkins. He was still chatting with the co-pilot, oblivious to everything else. Good. That was what I needed, a distraction, an opportunity. I shifted slightly in my seat, just a little. An almost imperceptible movement. I felt a twinge in my lower back, a reminder of my age. I ignored it. This was more important. I adjusted the backrest, tilting it back just a fraction of an inch. Then I leaned forward, ever so slightly, bringing my head closer to the headrest in front of me. I craned my neck, angling my head just so. It gave me a clearer view of the instrument panel in the cockpit. Not a perfect view, but better than before. Enough to see the readings, enough to confirm my suspicions. I held my breath for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the engines, the gentle whoosh of the air conditioning, the muted chatter of the other passengers. Everything seemed normal, but I knew better. I'd seen that look in Jenkins's eyes, the look of overconfidence, the look of someone who thought they knew everything. He didn't. And that was the danger. I took a slow, deep breath, letting it out slowly. My heart was beating a little faster now, a mix of anticipation and excitement. This was it, the first move, the first piece in place. I glanced at Jenkins. He was still engrossed in his conversation, completely unaware of my subtle maneuvering. Good, let him talk. Let him bask in his youthful arrogance. He wouldn't be laughing for long. I adjusted my glasses, the familiar weight settling on the bridge of my nose. The lenses, slightly smudged, reflected the faint glow of the cabin lights. I wiped them clean with a corner of my handkerchief. Every detail mattered. Clarity was essential. I needed to see. I needed to know. I needed to be ready. The game had begun. And I, the old engineer, the retired grandpa, was about to make my move. I settled back into my seat, my body still, my mind alert, waiting, watching. The first piece was in place. Now I just had to wait for the right moment to move the next one. The drinks trolley rattled down the aisle, a familiar sound of air travel. I wasn't particularly thirsty, but this was an opportunity. A chance to further solidify the image I wanted to project. The harmless old man, a bit doddering, easily confused, certainly not a threat to anyone, least of all a confident young pilot like Jenkins. "Anything for you, sir?" the flight attendant asked, her smile bright and professional. "Oh, yes," I said, feigning a slight hesitation. "Let me see now, what do you have?" I peered at the selection of drinks as if I'd never seen anything like it before. "We have orange juice, apple juice, water, tea, coffee," she began, patiently reciting the options. "Coffee, yes," I said a little too loudly. "Coffee would be lovely, black, no sugar." "Certainly, sir." She poured me a cup, the aroma filling the air. I took it from her, my hand trembling slightly, a deliberate affectation. "Thank you, dear," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Very kind of you." She moved on to the next passenger, and I took a small sip of the coffee. It was hot, a bit too hot, but I didn't react. I just kept sipping, my eyes fixed on the cockpit door as if I was trying to remember something important. A few minutes later, another flight attendant came by with a basket of snacks. "Would you like a biscuit, sir?" she asked. "Biscuit," I repeated as if the word was unfamiliar to me. "Oh, you mean a cookie." She smiled politely. "Yes, sir, a biscuit or a cookie." "Oh, yes," I said, chuckling softly. "A cookie." "Well, in that case, yes, please. One of those chocolate ones." She handed me a biscuit and I took it with a shaky hand, fumbling slightly as I tried to put it on my tray table. "Thank you, dear," I mumbled. "Very, very kind." I nibbled on the biscuit, making a small mess of crumbs on my shirt. I brushed them away with a clumsy hand, further enhancing the image of a slightly confused older gentleman. I let my gaze wander around the cabin, occasionally pausing to stare blankly at a fellow passenger, as if I wasn't quite sure where I was. When the flight attendant came back to collect the rubbish, I engaged her in a rambling conversation about the weather. "Lovely day for flying, isn't it?" I said, my voice a little too loud. "Although I must say it seems a bit bumpy, don't you think?" "There's a little turbulence, sir," she replied, her voice soothing, professional. "Perfectly normal at this altitude." "Oh, of course," I said, nodding vigorously. "Perfectly normal, just, you know, a little disconcerting for an old man like me." I chuckled nervously. She smiled politely and moved on, leaving me to continue my performance. I took another sip of my coffee, spilling a few drops on my shirt. "Oh dear," I muttered, dabbing at the stain with my napkin. "Clumsy old fool." I glanced towards the cockpit, a faint smile playing on my lips. Jenkins was still chatting away, completely oblivious to my little act. His guard was down, exactly where I wanted it. The mask of innocence was firmly in place. The harmless old man, a bit doddering, a bit confused, certainly not someone to be taken seriously, and that, I knew, was my greatest advantage. The plane leveled off, a gentle shift in pressure against my eardrums confirming what the little chime and the blinking off of the seatbelt sign already announced. A low murmur of conversation, the rustling of plastic bags, and the clinking of ice in plastic cups filled the cabin as people began to stir, to stretch, to reclaim the personal space the confines of economy class had temporarily denied them. I, however, stayed put, my hands clasped loosely in my lap. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the serene face of Mrs. Gupta, my yoga instructor back in Stuttgart. "In," she would say, her voice a calming balm. "Hold. Out." I followed her instructions, taking a slow, deep breath. In, hold, out. It did help with the nerves, or what little nerves I had. It certainly helped with the nagging ache in my lower back, a constant companion these days. Truth be told, though, I wasn't really nervous. More focused, like a finely tuned engine ready to perform. A Daimler-Benz engine, of course. Nothing else would do. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the cockpit door. The cheap plastic felt flimsy, almost an insult to the complex machinery it concealed. I could just make out the edge of the instrument panel through the small gap between the door and the frame. Not clearly, mind you. Just a sliver of gray and black, a hint of glowing dials, but enough. Enough to see what I needed to see. The plane had reached its cruising altitude. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The culmination of weeks of planning, of meticulous preparation. I leaned forward slightly, craning my neck, trying to get a better view of the altimeter. The numbers were small, difficult to read from this distance, especially with the flickering cabin lights. I squinted, adjusting my glasses, the familiar weight settling on the bridge of my nose. They were rimless titanium frames, another retirement gift, this one from my wife. Practical and elegant, just like her. There. Through the blur and the shadows I could just make it out. 30,000 feet. That's what it should be, according to the flight plan I'd acquired. But something was off, just a hair off, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. But enough. Enough for me to know. My gut, honed by decades of engineering experience, told me something wasn't right. I glanced at my watch. A simple, elegant timepiece. A retirement gift from my colleagues at Mercedes. Engraved on the back were the words for your unwavering precision. Precise, reliable like everything I valued. L. Ike, the perfectly balanced crankshaft of a V12 engine. I checked the time, 14:37 GMT. Then I looked back at the altimeter, focusing all my attention on those tiny, distant numbers. I waited. 1 minute, counting the seconds ticking by on my watch. 2 minutes. The hum of the engines filled the silence. 3. The numbers hadn't changed. They should have. Even at cruising altitude, there are minor fluctuations. Tiny adjustments to compensate for air pressure, wind speed, 1,000 other variables. But the altimeter was stuck. Frozen. Like a faulty gauge on a prototype engine I once oversaw back in '87. The memory surfaced unbidden, the frustration, the long nights troubleshooting, the eventual satisfaction of finding the flaw. This, however, was different. This wasn't a prototype. This was a passenger jet, hurtling through the sky at 500 miles an hour. I closed my eyes again, visualizing the schematics of the altimeter. The intricate workings, the delicate balance of sensors and gears, the complex interplay of pneumatic and electronic systems. I'd studied these things for years, pored over manuals, dissected diagrams, even built a working model in my basement workshop. I knew them inside and out, better perhaps than the pilots themselves. And I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, beyond mere calculation, that something was wrong, very wrong. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the cockpit door. The faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of my lips. Not a smile of amusement, but of grim satisfaction. I had confirmation. My initial suspicions, painstakingly gathered and meticulously analyzed, were correct. The altimeter was malfunctioning. The stage was set. The game was afoot. And I, the old engineer, the retired grandpa, as my granddaughter affectionately called me, was ready to play. Let the games begin. The plane started to shake, just a little at first, a gentle shudder like a dog shaking off water. I felt it in the soles of my feet, a subtle vibration through the floor. Then it got stronger, a more pronounced bump followed by another and another. The low murmur of conversation in the cabin died down, replaced by a nervous silence. I glanced around. People were gripping the armrests, their faces tense. A baby started to cry, a thin, reedy wail cutting through the stillness. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. The turbulence, mild as it was, would exacerbate the problem with the altimeter, making the discrepancy in the readings more pronounced, more obvious. It was the perfect opportunity to cast my bait. I waited a few minutes, letting the turbulence build, letting the tension in the cabin rise. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the cockpit, the clipped tones of the pilots communicating with air traffic control. The sound was muffled, distorted by the intervening door, but I could sense a change in their tone, a hint of concern. I took a slow, deep breath, calming my nerves, preparing myself for the next step. This was the crucial moment. The moment of truth. I had to play it just right. Too much, and I'd risk being dismissed as a panicky old man. Too little, and I might not get their attention. I waited for another particularly strong bump, the kind that made the overhead compartments rattle. Then I cleared my throat, a loud, exaggerated sound that cut through the silence in the cabin. I glanced towards the cockpit, making sure I had their attention. Jenkins, I could see, was looking back at me, his brow furrowed. Good. He'd noticed. "Excuse me, Captain," I called out, my voice calm, clear, projecting just the right amount of concern. Not panic, just concern. "I'm not sure, but are the instruments reading correctly?" I paused, letting the question hang in the air. I could see Jenkins talking to the co-pilot, pointing towards the altimeter. Then he turned back to me, his face a mask of professional politeness, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. "Everything's under control, sir," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too reassuring. "Just a bit of turbulence, perfectly normal at this altitude." "Yes, of course," I replied, nodding slowly, "but I'm not sure." The altimeter, it seems to be fluctuating, quite a bit actually. I paused again, letting the words sink in. I could see Jenkins exchanging glances with the co-pilot, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. They were starting to take the bait. I've been watching the readings, I continued, my voice still calm but with a hint of urgency now. And they don't seem to be consistent, it's just an observation, of course. But I trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The implication that something wasn't right, that they might be in danger. Jenkins sighed, a small, exasperated sound. He was clearly losing patience. "Sir," he said, his voice tight, "I assure you everything is perfectly normal. We have the situation under control." "I'm sure you do, Captain," I replied, my voice still calm but with a touch of steel now. "But I've been working with precision instruments for over 30 years, and something just doesn't seem right." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I'd appreciate it if you double-check the readings, Captain. Just to be safe." I could see the wheels turning in Jenkins's head. He was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, to reconcile his confidence in the technology with the nagging doubt I'd planted in his mind. The bait was cast. Now all I had to do was wait for him to take the hook. "Don't you worry, sir," Jenkins said, his voice tight. He forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a flicker of annoyance there now, a tightening around his mouth. "Like I said, it's just a bit of turbulence, perfectly normal. We have state-of-the-art equipment. Everything is under control." He turned back to his controls, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. I sat back in my seat, my face impassive, but inside I felt a surge of satisfaction. He'd taken the bait. He dismissed my concerns. He doubled down on his confidence in the technology. Exactly what I'd expected. Exactly what I'd wanted. The plane lurched again, a sudden, sharp drop that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. The baby started crying again, louder this time, its cries echoing the rising anxiety in the air. I glanced around. People were clutching their armrests, their faces pale. Even the flight attendants looked a little uneasy. Captain," I said, my voice calm but with a touch of urgency now. "I really think you should check those instruments again. The turbulence seems to be increasing." Jenkins turned back to me, his face flushed. "Sir," he said, his voice sharper now, "I told you everything is fine. Please just sit back and relax." "With all due respect, Captain," I replied, my voice still calm but firm, "I don't think it is. The altimeter readings are still fluctuating. And the airspeed indicator, it doesn't seem to be registering correctly." I could see the doubt creeping into Jenkins's eyes. The bravado, the easy confidence was starting to crack. He glanced at the co-pilot, who looked equally concerned. They exchanged a few hurried words, their voices low, urgent. The plane lurched again, even more violently this time. A few loose items tumbled from the overhead compartments, adding to the growing sense of panic in the cabin. The baby's cries intensified, a high-pitched shriek that mirrored the rising fear in the air. "Captain," the co-pilot said, his voice strained, "I think we should check the instruments, just to be safe." Jenkins hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched tight. He was clearly struggling with the decision, torn between his pride and the growing evidence that something was wrong. The turbulence continued, relentless, each jolt chipping away at his confidence, at his carefully constructed facade of control. Finally he sighed, a small, defeated sound. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's run a diagnostic just to be sure." He turned back to the controls, his hands moving quickly, his fingers dancing over the buttons and switches. I watched him closely, my heart pounding in my chest. The trap had closed. The game was entering its final stage. The turbulence kept getting worse. The plane bucked and swayed like a small boat in a choppy sea. Loose objects rattled around in the overhead compartments. A few people gasped, their knuckles white as they gripped the armrests. The baby, bless its heart, was still crying, its wails a constant counterpoint to the rising tension in the cabin. Jenkins's face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. He was hunched over the controls, his hands moving quickly, his fingers dancing over the buttons and switches. He muttered something under his breath, a string of technical jargon I couldn't quite make out. The co-pilot, his face even paler than Jenkins's, was flipping through a thick manual, his lips moving as he read. He looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Captain," he said, his voice strained, "the altimeter readings are still off, and the airspeed indicator, it's fluctuating wildly." Jenkins slammed his fist on the control panel, a sharp crack that echoed through the cockpit. "Damn it," he muttered. "What the hell is going on?" He grabbed the manual from the co-pilot, his eyes scanning the pages, his breathing rapid and shallow. He flipped back and forth, his frustration growing with each passing second. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not anger, not annoyance, something else. Something almost like fear. He turned back to the manual, his fingers tracing the lines of text, his brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes fixed on a particular page. He read it again, slowly, carefully, as if trying to memorize every word. Then he looked up at the co-pilot, his eyes wide with realization. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice hushed, almost reverent. Do you see this?" He pointed to the page, his finger trembling slightly. The co-pilot leaned in, his eyes scanning the text. He nodded slowly, his face pale. "Yes, Captain," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Richard Falk, the Falk recalibration method." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and hope. "Sir," he said, turning to Jenkins, "Richard Falk, he's a legend in aviation instrumentation. He designed this method decades ago. It's brilliant. It could work." Jenkins stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. The arrogance, the bravado, the condescending chuckle, it was all gone, replaced by a stunned silence. The mask had fallen. "Mr. Falk," Jenkins said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a strange mixture of embarrassment and respect. Could you help us?" I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Of course, Captain," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I'd be glad to." I unbuckled my seatbelt, the familiar click echoing in the sudden silence of the cockpit. I stood up, slowly, carefully, mindful of my aching knees. I stepped into the cockpit, the narrow space feeling cramped after the relative spaciousness of my aisle seat. I glanced at the instrument panel, my eyes scanning the dials and gauges, confirming what I already knew. The altimeter was still off. The airspeed indicator was fluctuating erratically. The situation was precarious. "The Falk recalibration method, sir," the co-pilot said, his voice hushed, almost reverent. It's in the manual. But it's complex. We've never actually used it before." "It's not that complex," I said, my voice calm, reassuring. "Just requires a bit of precision." I reached out, my hand hovering over the controls. "First," I said, pointing to a small dial on the altimeter, "we need to adjust the barometric pressure setting. Manually. See this knob? Turn it, slowly, clockwise, until the reading matches the current atmospheric pressure." I watched as Jenkins, his hands trembling slightly, carefully adjusted the knob. His movements were hesitant, uncertain. He was used to relying on the automated systems. This manual adjustment was unfamiliar territory. "Now," I continued, pointing to another dial, "we need to calibrate the airspeed indicator. See this lever? Pull it gently towards you and hold it there, while I adjust the pitot tube." I reached down, my fingers finding the small, L-shaped tube protruding from the fuselage. I adjusted it carefully, my movements precise, deliberate. "Okay," I said after a moment. "Release the lever." Jenkins released the lever, his eyes fixed on the airspeed indicator. The needle, which had been fluctuating wildly, began to stabilize. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with something, almost like wonder. "Now," I said, pointing to the attitude indicator, "we need to adjust the—" I continued to guide Jenkins through the process. step by step, explaining each adjustment, each calibration in simple, clear terms. He listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet attentiveness. He followed my instructions carefully, his hands now steady, his movements precise. He was learning. Finally, as the last adjustment was made, the turbulence which had been relentless began to subside. The plane steadied, the shaking diminishing, the rattling of loose objects ceasing. The airspeed indicator settled on a steady reading. The altimeter displayed the correct altitude. The attitude indicator showed a level flight path. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The baby's cries subsided, replaced by a quiet whimpering. People began to relax, their grip on the armrests loosening, their faces regaining their color. Then something unexpected happened. Someone started clapping, then another, and another. Soon the entire cabin erupted in applause, a spontaneous outpouring of gratitude for the old man who had saved the day. I stood there in the cramped confines of the cockpit, my hands resting on the controls, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling me. It wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about proving Jenkins wrong. It wasn't about the years of work, the countless hours spent honing my skills, the quiet pride I took in my expertise. It was about something more. It was about using my knowledge, my experience to help others, to make a difference, to restore order, to bring calm. The quiet, steady calm of a well-engineered machine functioning perfectly, precisely as it was designed to do. And in that moment, surrounded by the applause of grateful passengers, I felt a profound sense of peace. The clapping faded. The hum of the engines, a constant, reassuring drone, filled the sudden silence. The turbulence was gone, the plane now gliding smoothly, a gentle giant soaring through the clear blue sky. I stood there, my hands still resting lightly on the controls, feeling the subtle vibrations through my fingertips. It was a familiar sensation, a comforting reminder of the power, the precision, the intricate complexity of the machine I had just helped to control. I glanced at Jenkins. He was staring at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. The cocky grin, the casual smirk, the easy arrogance that had filled the cockpit just moments ago, it was all gone, vanished, replaced by a stunned silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked down at his hands, then back at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of I couldn't quite place it. Embarrassment, disbelief, perhaps a bit of all three. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out, just a quiet, almost inaudible gasp. The co-pilot, too, was silent. He sat there staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the controls, his knuckles white. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Or perhaps he'd seen the ghost of his own arrogance, his own blind faith in technology, reflected back at him in the calm, steady gaze of an old engineer who knew a thing or two about machines. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engines and the faint whisper of the air conditioning. It was the silence of realization, the silence of understanding, the silence of respect. A respect I knew that had been hard-earned, a respect that had been extracted, not demanded, a respect that perhaps would never have been given had it not been for this incident, this lesson. This quiet, understated triumph of experience over arrogance. Jenkins finally looked away, his gaze drifting towards the instrument panel. He reached out, his hand hovering over the controls, then pulled it back. He seemed lost, like a child who'd suddenly realized he'd wandered into the deep end of the pool. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading, seeking guidance, seeking forgiveness. But I offered neither, not yet. The silence, I knew, was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. It was the silence of judgment, the silence of reckoning, the silence of truth. And in that silence, in that heavy, pregnant pause, the balance of power in the cockpit shifted. Subtly, irrevocably. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, a soft shudder running through the cabin. The usual sounds of landing, the whine of the engine spooling down, the hiss of the hydraulics, the clunk of the landing gear locking into place, were almost comforting. A return to normalcy, a return to order. I stayed in my seat, watching as the other passengers gathered their belongings, their faces a mixture of relief and something else. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. They'd seen what had happened. They'd heard the applause. They knew that the old man in 27B had done something important. I waited until most of the passengers had disembarked. I didn't want to fuss. I just wanted to get off the plane, get back to my holiday. Put this whole incident behind me. As I was gathering my things, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around. It was Jenkins. He stood there looking down at me, his face a mixture of, well, it was hard to say. Embarrassment, certainly, but also something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just humility. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Falk," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I just wanted to thank you." He paused, searching for the right words. For everything." "You're welcome, Captain," I replied, my voice neutral. I didn't want to make it easy for him. He'd earned this discomfort. I was wrong," he continued, his voice still quiet. About everything, about the altimeter, about you." He looked down at his feet, then back at me. I apologize for my arrogance." "Apology accepted, Captain," I said, my voice softening slightly. He said the words. That was all I needed. The acknowledgement, the admission of guilt, the recognition of experience. I learned a valuable lesson today, Mr. Falk," he said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "A lesson I won't forget." He extended his hand. "Thank you," he said again, his grip firm, sincere. I shook his hand, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. "You're welcome, Captain," I said again, "and good luck." He nodded, a small, almost grateful nod. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. I watched him go, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling me. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the satisfaction of order restored, the satisfaction of balance regained, the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, experience trumps arrogance. Weeks later, back in Stuttgart, I was sitting in my garden. Sun was shining, birds were singing. My coffee was just the right temperature, not too hot, not too cold, just right. Like Goldilocks, my wife always joked. She was inside, puttering around in the kitchen. I could hear the faint clinking of dishes, a comforting, familiar sound. I was thinking about the flight, about Jenkins, about the whole incident. It felt like a dream now. A strange, unsettling dream. But it had happened. I knew it had happened. I could still feel the tremor in my hands as I guided Jenkins through the recalibration procedure. I could still hear the nervous silence in the cockpit, the rising panic in the cabin, the relieved applause as the plane steadied. I took a sip of my coffee, the warm liquid a soothing balm. I closed my eyes for a moment, savoring the peace, the quiet, the order of my garden. My roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile gray of the airplane cabin. I could smell the sweet fragrance of the blossoms, a heady perfume that filled the air. I opened my eyes, my gaze settling on a small wren flitting about in the branches of the apple tree. It was a tiny creature, delicate, fragile, yet perfectly adapted to its environment. It knew its place. It knew its role. It didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It just was. I thought about Jenkins, his youthful arrogance, his blind faith in technology, his dismissive chuckle. He thought he knew everything. He'd thought experience was obsolete. He'd been wrong, dead wrong. I felt a small flicker of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of revenge, not at all, but the satisfaction of order restored. The satisfaction of seeing arrogance humbled, experience vindicated. The satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the old ways, the tried and true methods, the accumulated wisdom of years, still had value, still had power, still mattered. I took another sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, chasing away the last vestiges of the chill I'd felt on that plane. The incident, I realized, hadn't just reaffirmed the value of experience. It had reaffirmed the value of calm. The quiet, steady calm that comes from knowing who you are, you know, and what you can do. The calm that comes from a lifetime of dedication to precision, to logic, to order. I finished my coffee, the cup now empty, a hollow echo of the warmth it had once held. I stood up slowly, carefully, my knees creaking in protest. I walked over to the rose bushes, their vibrant blooms a testament to the enduring power of nature, of growth, of renewal. I bent down, inhaling the sweet fragrance of the blossoms, a deep, cleansing breath that filled my lungs with the scent of peace. The peace of my garden, the peace of my home, the peace of my life. The incident on the plane, I knew, would stay with me. A reminder, a lesson, but it wouldn't define me. It wouldn't disturb the quiet order I'd so carefully constructed. I was back where I belonged, back in my place, back in balance. And that, I realized, was all that mattered. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air is sharp and clean, and the sunlight slants through the trees, painting long shadows across the lawn. I was sitting in my garden, enjoying my morning coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way I like it. The local paper was spread out on the table in front of me, the pages rustling slightly in the gentle breeze. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth, the familiar bitterness. It was a quiet morning, peaceful, just the way I liked it. The birds were singing in the trees, a cheerful chorus that blended with the distant hum of traffic from the nearby road. I could hear Martha, my wife, humming softly in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The familiar sounds of home, comforting, reassuring. I glanced at the headline of the paper. Local council debates new parking regulations. Not exactly gripping stuff, but it was familiar, part of the rhythm of my retired life. The small dramas of local politics, the mundane concerns of everyday life. A far cry from the high-stakes world of international business I'd inhabited for so many years. I folded the paper, placing it neatly on the table. I wasn't really reading it anyway. My mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the moment, the peace, the quiet, the order. The incident on the plane, the one with the young pilot, Jenkins, it felt like a distant memory now, almost like a dream. A strange, unsettling dream. But it had happened. I knew it had happened. I could still recall the feeling of the controls beneath my fingertips, the tension in the cockpit, the relieved applause of the passengers. I took another sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, a pleasant contrast to the cool autumn air. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the garden wash over me. The birdsong, the rustling leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the world turning. I opened my eyes, my gaze settling on a small red squirrel scampering up the trunk of the oak tree at the edge of the lawn. It paused for a moment, its bright eyes fixed on me, then continued its ascent, disappearing into the dense foliage. I watched it go, a small smile playing on my lips. Life going on. The incident on the plane, I realized, had changed me, not in any dramatic way, but it had reinforced something. Something I'd always known but perhaps forgotten. Something about the value of experience, the value of knowledge, the value of competence. I'd spent my entire career striving for excellence, for precision, for order. And in that moment on that plane, facing a crisis that threatened the lives of everyone on board, those years of dedication, of hard work, of meticulous attention to detail had paid off. I hadn't sought the spotlight. I hadn't wanted to be a hero. I'd simply done what I knew how to do, what I'd been trained to do, what I was good at. I finished my coffee, the cup now empty, a hollow echo of the warmth it had once held. I stood up slowly, carefully, stretching my stiff muscles. The autumn air was crisp, invigorating. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, sharp scent of life. The incident on the plane, I knew, would stay with me. A reminder. A lesson, but it was in the past. A closed chapter. I was back to my routine, back to my life, back to order. And that, I realized, was all that mattered. I looked straight into that camera lens, the small red light a pinpoint in the dimness of the workshop. A little smile, I think, crept into my face. It wasn't a smug smile, not exactly. More like a knowing smile, the kind you get when you've finally proven everyone wrong. It felt strange, this smile, unfamiliar on my face after so many years of tight-lipped determination. A flicker of Amelia's face, her condescending smirk from that last meeting, flashed through my mind. Gone now, replaced by this quiet, confident curve of my lips. Machines never mocked me, I said, my voice a little rough from disuse. I hadn't spoken to anyone directly for days, preferring the company of my tools and the hum of the engine I was rebuilding. I thought about that statement for a second, letting it resonate. It was true. Engines, transmissions, altimeters, they just are. They work or they don't. No judgment, no laughter, just the pure, unadulterated logic of mechanics, a comforting thought. Unlike the snickers from Jenkins and his crew when I suggested a different approach to the cooling system. They called me old-timer, patted me on the shoulder like I was a doddering fool. The memory stung, even now. A dull ache in my chest, but the sting was fading, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Only men did, I continued, looking right into that lens, like I was talking directly to Jenkins. Like I was talking to everyone who'd ever underestimated me. Everyone who'd ever discounted experience, dismissed knowledge, just because it came with a few gray hairs. I remembered my father, his calloused hands guiding mine as he taught me the intricacies of a carburetor. He'd told me, son, experience is a hard teacher, but her lessons stick. He was right. And now those lessons were about to be shared. And men always learn too late. I let that hang in the air for a beat, let it sink in. The silence in the workshop felt heavy, pregnant with meaning. The only sound was the faint whirring of the cooling fan I'd salvaged from a junkyard, the very fan Jenkins had scoffed at. Now, it was the centerpiece of my vindication, a testament to the power of experience. Then, I shifted gears. I took a deep breath, adjusted the camera slightly, and leaned forward. Now, I said, my voice a bit brighter, a bit more inviting. I wanted to connect with others, the ones who knew what it felt like to be overlooked. I know I'm not the only one. I know there are others out there. Others who have been underestimated, dismissed, laughed at, patronized, told their ideas were outdated, their methods obsolete. I paused, remembering the countless times I'd been brushed aside in meetings, my suggestions met with rolled eyes and impatient sighs. Others who have shown those young whippersnappers a thing or two. A genuine smile this time spread across my face. The memory of the engine roaring to life, the look of stunned disbelief on Jenkins' face, it was a potent elixir. If that's you, I said, looking right into the camera again, making direct eye contact with that imagined audience, I want to hear your story. Tell me about the time you proved them wrong. Tell me about the moment you silenced the doubters. Tell me about the sweet taste of victory. I leaned back slightly, gesturing towards the space below the camera frame. Share it in the comments below. Let's show the world that experience still counts, that wisdom still has value, that knowing how things work, truly work, isn't something you can learn from a textbook or a simulator. I tapped my temple. It's up here, and it's priceless. I paused, one last thought coming to mind. That old dogs can still learn new tricks and teach a few along the way. I reached out and clicked the stop recording button, the red light vanishing. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, lighter, hopeful.